Hello and welcome to yet another edition of International Relations with Professor Pushpesh Pant. This is a weekly program which we curate, keeping in mind the special needs of the aspirants of the Indian Civil Service examinations. Our effort always is to review important events, individuals, issues that impinge on India's national interest and have an impact on our foreign policy. These are dialogues, if one may say so, because we treat the comments column as a dialogue, ongoing dialogue between the lecturer and those who are receiving the content, to give them a fair idea of what is happening in the world. And different episodes are interlinked. So no one episode is giving you the distilled essence of wisdom about international relations in totality, but what we have for you this time is a very interesting topic, the crisis in Pakistan. Now, India's troubled neighborhood is important, perhaps the most important issue for India's foreign policy and international relations. Our relationship with superpowers depends to a very large extent on what our relationship with our neighbors is. And for the past few recent years, the neighborhood has been a very turbulent one, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is Nepal, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it is Myanmar, with the possible exception of Bhutan, and including Myanmar, which has had ups and downs, we have a turbulent neighborhood. And when we talk of Pakistan, which is perhaps the most heavy burden which India has borne ever since its independence. So what we intend to do with you this time is to take a close look at crisis in Pakistan and try to put it in perspective. So sometime in future, when we discuss Indo-Pak relations, it becomes easier for you to weigh for yourself and assess what matters where and how. The crisis in Pakistan has been continuing for quite some time. One could even argue that ever since the birth of Pakistan, it has been a country ridden with the crisis. Briefly, to look at the historical background, Pakistan has been the greatest challenge for Indian foreign policy ever since the partition. It was created as an artificial theocratic state. It was a tragic climax to the two-nation theory which the British had propagated with their doctrine of divide and rule, dividing the people of the subcontinent, for which they paid a very heavy price. There is no need to go into the details of the British motivations. The British thought that when the independence of South Asia was inevitable, they would leave it in a vacant state so they could control it by remote control, so to speak. The unsettled conditions which came in the wake of Pakistan, the riots, the refugees, created ill will between India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, the indecisiveness of some Indian princes to join the Indian Union or to opt for Pakistan, they thought that they would live as independent sovereign countries, disregarding the geopolitical compulsions, tempted Pakistan to make a grab for Kashmir, and they launched in the garb of irregular Razakars an attack on Kashmir. This was the genesis of the first Indo-Pak war in 47-48. It ended with a ceasefire and a reference to the United Nations for Pakistan to withdraw its troops from the area it had occupied. But this is to be borne in mind because this is the Kashmir dispute which continues to plague Indo-Pak relations. Also, there were other irritating issues. There were issues like river waters, how they would be distributed, how the property, the assets of the two states would be equitably divided, what concessions would be made, and so on and so forth. All this is at the back of your mind, should always be there. Other thing which often is overlooked is that Pakistan is not a small country. Pakistan is small in comparison to India, but in terms of population, it is the fifth largest country in the world. Its population of 23.3 million people is pretty large. And if you see at the pie chart, you would see one feature of this population is that it is very, very diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of linguistic preferences of the people, and their concentration in different regions. So this regional diversity, linguistic diversity, has also been putting Pakistan apart. It resulted in the separation of Bangladesh finally in 1971. The continuing insurgencies in Balochistan, the disgruntlement in Sindh continues. Pakhtunkhwa also you can see. So this would be interesting for you to keep in mind. You can always go back to the PDF PowerPoint presentations and refresh your memory about what we have been discussing. So first thing is to remember is Pakistan is an artificially created theocratic state. Problems for Pakistan start from day one because of dispute about Kashmir, which was engineered by Pakistan, and also its disgruntlement about river waters disputes, refugee property resettlement, etc. Other thing which is equally important is the steady decline of democracy and usurpation of power by the armed forces in Pakistan. The early days of Pakistan, there was hopes that Pakistan would develop, if not as a secular country, but as a democratic country with enough liberal values enshrined. That is what Quaid-e-Azam had promised, that the minorities would have all their rights in the new Pakistan. But this was not to be, because under very mysterious circumstances, the first prime minister was assassinated, Liaquat Ali Khan. Before that, Quaid-e-Azam had died himself due to a chronic illness which he had been suffering of. And there was an uneasy relationship between the armed forces in the Pakistan, the extremely orthodox Muslim Islamic factions in the politics, and the more liberal, Western educated segments of Pakistan. The interesting thing which made life difficult for Pakistan was that most of the educated upper class Muslims came as muhajirs from India, and they settled mostly for proximity from Bombay to Karachi in the Sindh province or in Lahore. Now, what would happen is that they settled, some of the elite, in Islamabad, and there was a divide between them and the average Muslims, Punjabi or Sindhis, who had stayed back, not stayed back, they had stayed put as Muslims in the new Pakistan. It is interesting that in the original conception of Pakistan, when a Cambridge-educated young man was offering, there was no place for Bangladesh, because they thought that Bangladesh was alien to what the West Pakistan ultimately turned out to be. The massive influx of refugees from India created social tensions, like influx of refugees from Pakistan to India also created some tensions on the social fabric. And later on, the refugees from Afghanistan also added to this problem. Pakistani army started looking towards the West for aid and assistance. This was largely due to the Cold War, logic of Cold War. The USA was thinking that Pakistan would provide a very convenient strategic base to, if not to attack, to look at observation posts for the soft underbelly of the then Soviet Union. And the military alliance system, which USA put in place, the CENTO, the SEATO, had a place for Pakistan, an important place for Pakistan in it. By the time we reached the mid-1950s, army was fairly well entrenched. And you have the civilian government appointing a martial law administrator, Field Marshal Ayub Khan, a Sandhurst-trained Pakka British military sahib, but very soon he refused to yield power and became a dictator, perpetually giving himself a Field Marshal's title, and reigned for almost 10 years. Now, this army takeover, the army's domination of the Pakistani politics, also is complicated by separatism in Pakistan. The historical roots go back in 1933. As we said, Rahmat Ali had a blueprint for Pakistan, which did not have the East Pakistan, later on the Bengali segment of Pakistan, into it, because they wanted to perpetuate the domination of the Punjabis and Pathans in Pakistan. And of course, they thought that the Bengalis, they may have been Muslims by name, but they practiced Islam, which was more syncretic, more liberal, more Sufi-oriented, more tolerant towards Hindu beliefs and practices. And they had a commitment to their language and culture, Bengali culture, which they shared with their Hindu brethren. And they found themselves aliens when they ended up in Pakistan, the Punjabi Pakistan. Different regions had different rationales for separatism. The Baluchis had a tribal ethnic identity. The Pakhtunkhwa people had a tribal identity. Waziristan people had a tribal identity. The Sindhis had a different ethnic identity. And this problem has been exacerbated because the army has been dominated by the Punjabis and the Pathans. Very few other ethnicities or regional interests are represented there. This has resulted also in regionally imbalanced economic development of Pakistan, large-scale corruption to which Pakistani army, the top echelons, turned the blind eye because they are parties to it. Pakistan's industrialization has suffered because of that, because the Pakistani top generals, after their retirement, are given large tracts of land to cultivate. They set up industries, they don't pay taxes, and this has led to a cancer gnawing at the entrails of Pakistan. In Balochistan, the separatist tendencies date back to before the creation of Pakistan. And Pakistani leadership has rejected the separatist demands very harshly. Brute force has been used against that. There has been no effort at dialogue or reconciliation or to accommodate them in supposedly a federal structure of Pakistani polity. There is a federal structure on paper, but the predominance of the Punjabis and Pathans nullifies anything of that. Again, the occupied region of Gilgit-Baltistan, which is Pak-occupied Kashmir, the people there are always complaining about the second-class citizenship, which they have per force. I think what is most important to remember is that Pakistan today carries with it a very heavy dead wood, the burden of the Cold War baggage. India followed a policy of non-alignment. It wanted to extend the area of peace. It wanted to stay outside the contest. But Pakistan wanted to have parity with much larger neighbor next door, India, and thought it would be convenient to join the American military alliance system, receive arms and weapons, and then use them or abuse them against India, or at least threaten India with them. It had happened. It gave Pakistan a very false notion of parity with India, which was repeatedly falsified whenever a military conflict took place. The claims of equality were exposed as very, very hollow. But also, the Cold War baggage was that other countries which were close to the United States of America, with the exception of Jewish Israel, were countries like Saudi Arabia, the oil-rich country, which was an Islamic nation. And the Pakistan could also argue that there was a fraternal relationship which Pakistan had with other Islamic nations and like Saudi Arab, and this was reinforced by the military alliance system, which Saudi Arab also sided with the Americans, so did Pakistanis, and the USA saw the opportunity to use the Karachi-Lahore area as the base in its presence in South Asia, and Pakistan very easily became a member of the treaty alliance systems, and India always saw this American patronage of Pakistan as threatening to its national interest because it made it impossible to have a dialogue for peace or reconcile differences amicably. Pakistan would resist that. It was in the 1970s that again an axis against India was created when China drew close to Pakistan. This was worked out, a relationship was worked out by the brilliant foreign minister of Pakistan, then Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and he brought into existence axis between Indonesia, China, and India, and India's leadership of non-aligned movement was challenged. And this was just before India had its border war with China. But all this is history. What we should concentrate on, when I say all this is history, I don't mean that you should neglect it and not remember this, but this is the background which continues to condition Pakistan's relationship with India, because if in 1971 Bangladesh was liberated with Indian assistance, it had created a wound in Pakistan who thinks in its psyche that it was broken up by India. It doesn't concede that India was forced to intervene for humanitarian reasons and because a war through indirect means was imposed on India by pushing millions of refugees on India, putting a strain on its economy. But what is interesting is, and then it goes back to a little later than that, Islamization of the Pakistani society under the dictatorship of General Zia. But all those factors remain important. They continue as bitter memories, lacerations, which in Pakistan's psyche condition its normalization of relationship with India. But what matters most is in international relations and the crisis in Pakistan today is the aftermath of 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan. Now, 9/11 was something traumatic for the United States of America. They vowed to track the rat who had done that to Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden had taken shelter in Tora Bora mountains in Afghanistan. Americans suspected that the Pakistanis were not cooperating with them in tracing him. Ultimately, it was years before, during President Obama's presidency, this could be done. But the Americans decided to intervene in Afghanistan, and then the war in Afghanistan started in 2000 at the turn of the new century. And I think this is where Pakistan got into another misconception. It believed that now it was becoming indispensable for Americans, because Americans needed the Pakistani bases to exercise control in Afghanistan. And of course, billions of dollars of American aid came to Pakistan. Most of it flew directly into the army coffers, and it was abused. It did not go for any developmental program or any modernization, not even modernization of army properly. But this was some kind of it made Pakistan a rentier state. It made Pakistan a parasite. It made Pakistan on crutches, and it gave Pakistan a very false sense of security that Americans would always come to their aid. At the same time, the Chinese were trying to entrap Pakistan in the debt by tempting it with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, by giving large-scale assistance for infrastructural programs and so on. And Pakistan at that stage, receiving money, I mean, when we say Pakistan, which means the elite of the army, which was taking decisions, to a certain extent, the internal security matters were being looked after by ISIS, the Special Intelligence Wing. There are rivalries between the top leadership of the ISIS and the army, various army commanders. But the fact remains that as long as debts were coming, American aid was coming, the Islamic Brethren were giving Pakistan billions of dollars, Pakistan was living under this false impression that all was well. There was General Musharraf, who was leading Pakistan after 9/11, who had engineered the Kargil war with India, but who had reversed course after he became the CEO of Pakistan and tried to get out of his uniform and become a civilian leader for a short while. The interesting part here is that having failed to convince the Taliban to hand over bin Laden and members, the Americans tried to fight Taliban and ultimately got them out of Kabul. A very heavy price was paid for this, and this has resulted in what is Pakistan's existential crisis at present is. First of all, there are 4 central issues in this crisis. It is something like a typhoid fever, where a whole lot of causes coalesce as symptoms to create a syndrome. So Pakistan's crisis syndrome is created by the debt crisis, which is the most glaring one at the moment. Pakistan doesn't have enough to feed itself. It doesn't have enough foreign exchange to import fuel, pharmaceuticals, at times to pay salaries to its people. Only part of it is due to corruption of the army, which doesn't pay taxes and uses all the aid for its selfish fattening of the pelf of their own coffers, etc. But this debt crisis was building up for years, and the obituary of Pakistan as a failed state has been written many a time before, and it has come back every time because its supporters come to its rescue. So one should not be hasty in writing yet another obituary of Pakistan and saying that this time Pakistan will finally become bankrupt, finally will default on its foreign debt repayments, finally the creditors would refuse to reschedule their debts, and Pakistan would fail. The implications of Pakistan failing disastrously economically would have hazardous consequences for the rest of the South Asia. But we'll not get into that. We are only asking you to keep in mind that one aspect of Pakistan's existential crisis is the economic crisis, which is the debt crisis. The second crisis is the terrorism. As the American Secretary of State then, Hillary Clinton had once said, if you have a snake pit and like to have snakes next to you in your house, one of these days, one of those venomous creatures, reptiles, is going to bite you. Now, this is what is happening to Pakistan. Apparently, they, with the US CIA's cooperation, had the poisonous crop of Taliban harvested in their nursery, hothouse, call it whatever you may, and they exported them to oust the then Soviet occupying forces from Russian forces from Afghanistan. But then when the Taliban refused to cooperate, it became poisonous. They wanted to get rid of Taliban, have not been done. Pakistan thought that Pakistan had had a faction, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. They thought that they had the Haqqani network, which had access to the top leadership of Taliban. Everybody thought, including the Americans, that the Taliban version 2 was very different from Taliban version 1. They were good Talibans and bad Talibans. All this has been disproved by now. But Pakistan has realized that even Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan is becoming more and more extremist and even targeting the Islamic leadership. In an Islamic state that Pakistan is, the pressure is increasing to implement more orthodox Sharia laws. And the skirmishes between the ISIS and the Taliban in Afghanistan, or Tehreek-e-Taliban, which has a constituency on both sides of the border, Durand line, which is disputed both by Pakistan and Afghanistan, has been creating problems near Jalalabad for Pakistan. Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan is closer in its militancy and its refusal to reconcile or negotiate with Pakistani leadership, where they claim they had not been treated very well. And the Pakistanis are really worried at the moment that their influence might extend from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border to other areas like Balochistan, to Sindh, where they have been active in recent past. The third aspect of Pakistan's crisis, existentialist crisis, is the climate crisis. Now, the whole world is talking about the catastrophic effects of climate change and global warming. But Pakistan has been a victim of it more dramatically than anybody else. There have been forest fires elsewhere. There have been tsunamis, mudslides in Europe. But what has happened in Pakistan last year is almost 1/3 of the country was flooded. The agricultural crop was destroyed totally. And this happened, unfortunately, in the area. This devastation of floods happened in an area which were regionally underdeveloped. They were areas of ethnic minorities who already have discontent against the central government. Now, all this is made even worse by the deep political instability. There has been this tug of war going on between the civilian elected government, army's favorites, and also army suddenly withdrawing its pleasure from its own poster boy, something like Imran Khan. So if you see in the past, there have been several rounds of dictatorships and elections and civilian governments, all ending disastrously, whether it was Bhutto's judicial execution, whether it was Mrs. Benazir Bhutto's assassination during a political rally, a gun attack on Imran Khan during a mass rally. These things are there. But let's get back to the most major part of the existential crisis, which is the economic doom. If you have a look at the chart, you will see that the government in Pakistan is living extremely hand-to-mouth conditions. The largest creditor is China. International Monetary Fund accounts for a very small percentage of its debts. The multilateral debts are multifaceted, and also when we say the more than bilateral debts are the Islamic nations which have come to Pakistan's aid. But all these have conditions of economic doom have worsened because of the COVID. Now, you can say that COVID create a bad impact on economic activity. You may say that floods have created disastrous effect on Pakistan's economy. But if you take a close objective look, even before that, the Pakistani economy was not doing well at all. It was chronically gripped with corruption at all levels. There was no industrial infrastructure. Couple of years back, the Pakistani ministers had to admit that Pakistan was no longer self-sufficient in food grains. Pakistan's cotton crop, sugarcane crop had been badly affected. Its exports had been affected. Its textile industry was underperforming in the manufacturing sector. The pharmaceutical companies could not manufacture drugs because they did not have money to import intermediaries. So all this is a challenge which Pakistan has been facing for past at least 5 years. Its domestic demand for steel and iron is between 7.3 million tons per year. Domestic production only accounts for 3.8 million tons, which means that almost half of its domestic demand has to be paid for through foreign exchange and imported. 2 to 3% decline in share of manufacturing sectors in the GDP in the last decade has been there. And the Pakistanis economists have been warning against this, but nobody has been listening to them. The question is whether the IMF now would release the much required 6.5 billion loan program immediately, the first tranche of at least $1 billion, so Pakistan can at least avert the default of the immediate repayments. The IMF, like other countries in South Asia, insists that other creditors must reschedule their debt repayments. Everybody should take a haircut, then it would release this. It also has very severe conditionalities. The taxes should be increased, prices should be regulated, imports should be restricted. Now, Pakistan can hardly have, adopt all these measures and also have political stability. Now, Pakistan has also, unfortunately, in the past few years, lost its strategic sensitivity for the United States of America. Their mind has been concentrated towards China's aggression in South China Sea, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and of course the instability in Afghanistan. And Pakistan is, if not on the back burner, is secondary importance to USA. But it is still important for us to realize that Pakistan is far too large a country, far too proximate a country for India, far too closely tied culturally, religiously to this country for us to gloat over its failure. The classic choice in default, in like whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Nepal, is a lack of the freedom of action to an elected prime minister. A free float of the currency that fell cumulatively by 35% over the past year. Inflation amounts to almost 35%. You can take any figure, and the figures are very alarming. They expect that the inflation would rise to and remain above 30% over the next few months. This is not going to make life easy for Pakistan. Nor is the Taliban threat going to retreat. The Taliban, a creation of Pakistan, has come back to bite the hand that fed it. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, we said earlier, is trying to extend its influence in Balochistan. Maybe some of them, at times, they are active in Sindh also. They have not... it has been alleged that they are the ones behind the Baloch attacks on Chinese advisors, which have created tensions between China and Pakistan. These militant groups work on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistan border. They have been emboldened to attack a Pakistani police headquarters in Karachi in February 2023. Both the Taliban threat and the Baloch insurgency. And this Afghan-Pakistan border is 2,670 kilometers long. It disputed on both sides, drawn by Durand, a British colonial officer, towards the end of the last century. And Baloch's insurgency also dates back to almost 75 to 80 years, if not more. So American withdrawal from Afghanistan has left Pakistan primarily to fend for itself. And this is going to be a great problem for Pakistan. I mean, what does it prioritize? Does it fight the terrorists first? Does it try to bring the economy under control? Does it try to cope for the natural disaster? And how does it cope with this? The newly appointed army chief has been distancing his institution from the Bajwa Doctrine. The Bajwa Doctrine was more or less peace and talks and ceasefire, which was a euphemism for saying live and let live, and have no interferences in their activities. But given the frequency of the attacks, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has shown that it has regrouped and reestablished beyond the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and will remain a very, very major threat for Pakistan. Devastating floods we have talked about before. They wiped away the agriculture. They wiped away the floods affected 33 million people, and more than 1,700 people lost their lives. 8 million people were displaced. they have not had enough rehabilitation. They are still clamoring for it because Pakistan doesn't have resources enough to do this. There have been hilarious situations where aid received from Turkey has been sent back after the earthquake from Pakistan to Turkey, making Pakistan a laughing stock. But this is more than a sarcasm involved here, which means that the aid received for the flood victims was not distributed effectively. The loss in the product's GDP is estimated as 2.2%, which means that the 9% of GDP is projected to contract over the next year. Housing, agriculture, livestock, transport, everything has been affected. And people estimate that almost amounting to US dollars $3.7 billion was affected. And Pakistan has no resources. So the natural calamity cannot be coped with because Pakistan economy is in its doldrum. Pakistan economy cannot be restored in foreseeable future because the people at helm are army, which are partly the problem, not partly the problem themselves, the major problem, not the solution. The assessment of damages exceeds 14.9 billion. Economic losses are estimated to reach 15.2 US billion. All this means that is beyond Pakistan's capacity to cope with it. Pakistan's turmoil, again, the political turmoil doesn't seem to subside at all. No Pakistani political party has emerged which can think beyond its basic constituency of a region like PPP in Sindh or Shahbaz Sharif's party in Pakistan. So it is the few dynasties, the Bhutto dynasty, Bhutto Zardari dynasty, if you may like to call it, or the Shahbaz Nawaz Sharif dynasty, and of course the army. So earlier in 1960s, it used to be said there are 22 families in Pakistan, industrial families, economic families, which dominate. But right now, it has boiled down to 2 or 3 political dynasties and the armed forces, the top echelons of the armed forces. This political turmoil is likely to continue. We mentioned to Imran Khan's, he was once very popular, handpicked by the army, but then Imran Khan's argument was that when he tried to have strategic autonomy to build up relationship with Russia and China, the Americans saw to it that he was ousted. Of course, he exposed some communications which were not meant to be shared, and the Pakistani army said that he was betraying national interest and security. A man who was once supposed to be a darling of the Pakistani people, a charismatic cricket player, a philanthrope who lived his life openly. Even when he married a Jewish woman, he did not hide it from his people. He had not lost his popularity. But right now, people think that the way Imran Khan has avoided arrest. Now, Imran Khan's argument is that if he is arrested, he might be done in the jail, or an assassination attempt has already been made on his life. But his followers feel, many of his followers and some Pakistani journalists feel that unless he takes on the army head on, he would remain almost non-effective actor in Pakistani politics. We have already talked about this. Imran Khan was shot in his leg. There was mayhem after this. His supporters tried to surround the forces, the enforcement people were coming to arrest him, serve a warrant on him. Sham charade was played, which people went and said, no, we did not find Imran Khan in his house. Within half an hour, Imran Khan was addressing his supporters from the very same place from his house. So there are various things in this interesting jigsaw puzzle about the Pakistan's politics. But the fact remains that no political party is in a position to take on the army's brutal might and its dominance. Now, also, there was a time when Pervez Musharraf was there, when Nawaz Sharif was there, when there was some kind of a civil society pressure, there was some kind of a judicial intervention, but all that seems to be something belonging to our past. Now, what do we conclude? The road ahead for Pakistan seems to be hard and full of pitfalls. Any miscalculation on a slight thing might lead to a cascading effect of catastrophic consequences. Since the withdrawal of USA from Afghanistan, Pakistan's strategic significance is reduced for America, but China has continued to treat Pakistan as a significant strategic asset to be used against India, to cut India down to size, to surround India with Pakistani threat, to whether it is a threat of proxy war in the territory of Jammu and Kashmir, the Union territories now, whether it is through infiltration of separatist Khalistanis into Punjab, whether it is trying to foment a drugs war in India through Pakistan. All this is China's doing in Pakistan, continues to be of help to Pakistan. The war in Ukraine has given Pakistan another lease of life, where Pakistan, despite all its problems, is still supported by China, to a certain extent by Russia. There have also been recent reports that Pakistan might buy cheaper Russian oil, which means that Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan would be on one side, and the realignment of forces in Middle East after Iran's rapprochement with Saudi Arab gives Pakistan a little more breathing space. There appear to be no sign of military relinquishing its stranglehold on Pakistan in near future. Internecine rivalries within army might continue. The regional separatist demands might continue to simmer. But all this is certainly not going to help India. India will have to look after its interests carefully in a long-term perspective as well as a short-term perspective. We shall discuss India's relationship with Pakistan separately some other time. Till we meet again, thank you and goodbye.